The smell of engine oil hung thick in the air of the small garage tucked into the far edge of the trade station. Grease stained the floor in old patches, and half-finished machines lay scattered on metal shelves. Walter Briggs sat on an overturned crate, wiping his hands with a cloth that had seen better decades. He was not a young man anymore. His hair had gone gray years ago, his hands were rough with calluses, and his back ached most mornings before he even stood up. But his eyes were sharp, and when it came to machines, nothing escaped his notice. The trade station orbited a quiet corner of space, far from the shining capital worlds where fast ships and fancy technology ruled everything. Here, people came to trade scraps, fix old parts, and mind their own business. Walter liked it that way. He had built a life for himself in this small garage, fixing what others called junk and turning it into something useful again. Outside, the station buzzed with the usual chatter of traders and travelers. Ships came and went, most of them sleek, fast, and covered in glowing lights that made them look more like toys than actual vehicles. Walter paid them no mind. He had his own vehicle, one he had built with his own two hands over many years. It sat parked outside his garage, a boxy, armored rover with thick metal plating, dented in more places than anyone could count, and patched together from parts that had come from a dozen different wrecks. It was slow. It was ugly, but it worked every single time, no matter what. That afternoon, two aliens walked into his garage. They were tall, with smooth blue skin and sharp eyes that scanned the room with obvious disdain. Their names were Dax and Torin, traders from a species known for their advanced technology and their pride in it. They had come to sell some spare parts and pick up a few tools, business Walter had done with them before. But this time, their eyes landed on the rover parked outside, and they could not hold back their laughter. "What in the stars is that thing?" Torin asked, his voice dripping with mockery. He walked around the rover, inspecting its dented sides and thick metal wheels. "Did you build this out of scrap from a garbage hauler?" Dax chuckled beside him. "Look at these plates. This is decades-old design. Even our children build better transports than this in their free time." Walter did not look up from his work. He was busy tightening a bolt on a small engine part, his hands moving with practiced ease. "It gets the job done," he said simply, not bothering to explain further. "Gets the job done," Torin laughed harder. "It probably cannot even reach half the speed of our smallest scout ship. Why would anyone build something so slow, so heavy, so primitive?" Walter finally looked up, his expression calm, almost amused. He had heard this kind of talk before, many times from many different species who thought speed and shine meant everything. He never bothered arguing. Instead, he simply said, "I didn't build it for looks. I built it to survive." The two aliens exchanged a glance, clearly unconvinced, and continued their teasing as they finished their business. They mocked the rover's slow speed, its lack of advanced computers, its simple manual controls. Walter let them talk, finishing his repairs and handing over the parts they had come to buy. He was used to being underestimated. It had happened his whole life, and he had learned long ago that the loudest laughter often came from those who understood the least. As Dax and Torin left the garage, still chuckling to themselves about the tin can parked outside, the station's speakers suddenly crackled to life. An announcement rang out across every corridor and platform, official and urgent. "Attention all station personnel. A cargo vessel has gone dark near Sector 7. Distress signal received before contact was lost. Emergency teams are being dispatched. Repeat, emergency teams are being dispatched to Sector 7. The words hung in the air, and for a moment the usual noise of the station seemed to pause. Traders stopped mid-conversation. Workers glanced toward the nearest windows, trying to catch sight of the debris field that surrounded Sector 7, a dangerous stretch of space littered with broken satellites, old wreckage, and jagged metal from long-forgotten battles. No one flew into that field without good reason. It was known across the station as a graveyard, a place where even skilled pilots hesitated to go. Walter set down his tools and walked to the garage entrance, watching the station lights flicker slightly as more announcements followed. Something about the tone of the voice on the speakers told him this was not a routine accident. There was worry in it, real worry, the kind reserved for situations far more serious than a simple cargo loss. He did not know it yet, but that single announcement would change everything. It would test every part of the old rover the aliens had just laughed at, and it would prove that sometimes the things built to survive matter far more than the things built to impress. Walter turned back toward his garage, his eyes drifting toward the rover parked outside, silent and steady, waiting as it always did. He had a feeling, quiet but certain, that its true purpose was about to begin. News traveled fast on a trade station, faster than any ship could fly. Within an hour, everyone from the dock workers to the food vendors knew about the cargo vessel that had gone dark near Sector 7. But it was not the loss of the ship itself that had people whispering in worried tones. It was what the ship had been carrying. Station Director Yelena Marcos stood in the control room, her face pale as she reviewed the manifest that had just come through from Central Records. The cargo vessel, it turned out, was not a simple trader. It had been smuggling something far more valuable, something that should never have been placed in danger like this. "A cub," she muttered, reading the details again to make sure she had not misunderstood. They were smuggling a live cub from the Kesh Reserve. The officers around her exchanged glances, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone in that control room, and indeed most of the galaxy, knew what the Kesh Reserve was. It was a protected homeworld, untouched by mining, war, or exploitation, set aside centuries ago as part of an ancient treaty between the galaxy's oldest star nations. On that world lived a species of predator, powerful, intelligent, and nearly extinct, that had become a living symbol of peace between civilizations that had once been bitter enemies. The predator species was called the threshback, named for the ridge of fur along its spine that rose when it sensed danger. They resembled something between a great wolf and a mountain lion, with thick fur, sharp claws, and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Only a few hundred of them remained across the entire galaxy, all protected under strict interstellar law. Harming one, or even endangering one, was considered one of the gravest crimes a person could commit. And now, a cub, a young threshback barely old enough to hunt on its own, was trapped somewhere in that ship, drifting silently in the debris field of Sector 7. How did smugglers even get their hands on a cub? One of the officers asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "That is a question for after we get it back safely," Director Marcos snapped, her patience thin. "Right now I need a rescue plan, fast." The problem was clear almost immediately. Sector 7's debris field was not like normal space. Decades of old wreckage, shattered satellites, and jagged metal fragments floated in a chaotic tangle, constantly shifting due to gravity pockets left behind by an old mining accident. Ion storms crackled through the debris at random intervals, frying electronics and disabling navigation systems within seconds. It was a place where advanced ships, the kind with delicate sensors and smooth hulls, simply could not survive for long. Dax and Torin, still on the station finishing their trade business, heard the news like everyone else. They exchanged a look of genuine concern, setting aside their earlier arrogance for a moment. Both of them owned fast, advanced scout ships, capable of incredible speeds and precise maneuvers. Surely, they thought, one of their ships could handle the rescue. They approached Director Marcos, offering their assistance. She welcomed it, desperate for any help she could get. But when the rescue team ran the numbers, feeding the debris field's data into Dax and Torin's ship computers, the results were not good. "Our sensors will not function properly in that ion interference," Torin said, staring at the readout with visible frustration. "Our hull plating is thin, made for speed, not impact resistance. If we fly in there, the wreckage will tear us apart within minutes." Dax nodded grimly. Our ships were not built for this kind of environment. None of the ships docked here were. Panic began to spread through the station as officials realized just how serious the situation had become. Every advanced vessel available was too fragile, too dependent on delicate systems that the debris field would destroy almost instantly. Meanwhile, the Cub's life support pod, damaged in the crash, was reportedly failing, with only a few hours of air and warmth remaining before it would be too late. Director Marcos rubbed her temples, trying to think of any other option. There has to be something. Some ship, some vehicle, anything that can survive that field long enough to reach the wreck and get back out. No one had an answer. The station's fastest ships were useless here, their strength lying in speed and technology, not endurance. The very things that made them impressive in open space made them fragile in a place like Sector 7. Word of the crisis eventually reached Walter's garage, carried by a young dock worker who often stopped by to trade small parts. He told Walter everything: the missing Cub, the failing life support, the ships that could not survive the debris field. Walter listened quietly, his expression unreadable, his hands still for the first time that day. Without saying a word, he set down the tool he had been holding and walked toward the door of his garage. His eyes moved toward his rover, sitting quietly outside, waiting as it always did. The dock worker asked him where he was going, but Walter did not answer right away. He simply looked out toward the direction of Sector 7, his jaw set with quiet determination, and began preparing his rover for a journey unlike any it had ever made before. Walter had not always been a mechanic on a quiet trade station. Long before he settled into this small corner of the galaxy, he had spent years working in dangerous mining colonies, places where machines had to survive harsh conditions or people simply did not come home. It was there that he had learned the most important lesson of his life. Fancy technology impressed people, but it rarely saved them. What saved people were machines built to endure, built to keep working no matter how bad things got. That lesson had stayed with him through every year since, and it was the reason his rover looked the way it did. As he stood beside it now, running his hands over its thick metal plating, he thought back to all the nights he had spent building it, piece by piece, using scraps others had thrown away. It was not pretty. It had never been pretty, but it had never failed him either. The dock worker who had brought him the news stood nearby, watching with confusion as Walter opened a hidden panel on the side of the rover, revealing a set of controls that looked nothing like the sleek touch screens found on modern ships. These were physical switches, levers, and dials, built to work even if every computer system failed. "You're not seriously thinking about flying into Sector 7, the young man said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Even the advanced ships can't survive that field." Walter did not look up from his work. That's because they weren't built to survive it. They were built to look good doing everything else. He continued his checks, tapping on thick radiation shielding welded into the rover's frame, inspecting backup mechanical systems that required no advanced computer to function. Everything on this vehicle had a manual backup, a simple solution in case the modern parts failed. It was slow, yes. It was heavy, yes. But it was built like a tank, designed to take a beating and keep moving forward. Word spread quickly across the station that Walter intended to attempt the rescue himself. Many thought he had lost his mind. Others simply laughed, remembering the mockery from earlier that day. Dax and Torin, still standing near the control room discussing options with Director Marcos, heard the news and could not believe it either. "The old man with the tin can," Torin said, raising an eyebrow. "Does he not understand what that debris field will do to him?" Dax shook his head slowly. "Perhaps he is simply desperate for attention, or perhaps he has no idea what real danger looks like." Despite their doubts, Director Marcos was out of options. Every advanced ship on the station had already been ruled out, their thin hulls and delicate sensors no match for the chaos of Sector 7. With the Cub's life support failing rapidly, She had little choice but to consider any possibility, however unlikely it seemed. She walked to Walter's garage herself, finding him already seated in the rover's cockpit, going through a final systems check. "You understand the risk," she said, her voice serious. "That field has destroyed ships far more advanced than your vehicle. I cannot guarantee your safety if you go in there." Walter looked at her, his expression calm despite the seriousness of her words. "I've flown through worse. Not in fancy places, but in mining fields back when I was younger. This rover was built for exactly this kind of situation. It doesn't rely on delicate sensors or thin armor. It relies on simple, honest engineering." Director Marco studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk against the rapidly shrinking window of time they had left. Finally, she nodded. "All right, you're cleared to attempt the rescue. But Walter, please be careful. That cub represents more than just one life. Its survival matters to peace between star nations that fought terrible wars centuries ago. If it dies, old wounds might reopen that we have worked hard to heal." Walter gave a small nod, understanding the weight of what she was saying. He was not a man who cared much for politics or treaties, but he understood the value of a life, any life, needing protection. As he prepared to leave, Dax and Torin approached, standing near the garage entrance, watching with expressions caught between doubt and curiosity. Torin opened his mouth to say something, likely another mocking remark, but something in Walter's calm determination made him hesitate. Instead, Dax simply said, "Good luck, old man." Walter offered a short nod in response before closing the rover's hatch and starting its engine. The vehicle rumbled to life, a low, steady sound very different from the smooth hum of modern ships. Slowly, deliberately, it moved away from the garage, heading toward the launch bay that would send it into the dangerous emptiness of Sector 7. As the rover disappeared from sight, Dax and Torin stood in silence for a moment, their earlier laughter replaced by an uneasy respect they were not quite ready to admit out loud. Whatever happened next, they both knew they were about to witness something far more important than a simple rescue mission. Space had a way of looking peaceful from a distance, calm and quiet, scattered with distant stars. But the moment Walter's rover crossed into Sector 7, that illusion shattered completely. The debris field stretched out before him like a graveyard frozen mid-collapse, twisted metal beams floating silently, broken satellites tumbling end over end, and jagged shards of old wreckage catching the dim light in sharp, dangerous glints. Walter gripped the manual controls tightly, his eyes scanning the chaos ahead. Unlike modern ships that relied on computer systems to calculate safe paths through obstacles, his rover required him to read the field with his own eyes, his own instincts built from decades of experience. He eased the throttle forward carefully, guiding the vehicle between two massive chunks of broken hull that drifted slowly past. The first ion storm hit without warning. A crackling burst of electrical energy surged through the debris field, and Walter watched as several small warning lights on his dashboard flickered and died. He had expected this. His rover's advanced systems, limited as they were, had already been shielded against exactly this kind of interference. Instead of panicking, he simply reached for the manual override lever and continued forward, relying on backup mechanical controls that did not depend on delicate electronics. Back on the station, Dax and Torin stood in the observation deck alongside Director Marcos, watching the feed from a long-range camera positioned near the edge of the debris field. The image was grainy and unstable, but they could see the small shape of Walter's rover moving steadily through the chaos, undeterred by the ion storm that had just struck. "How is it still moving?" Torin asked, genuine surprise in his voice. "Our sensors would have shut down completely in that kind of interference." Director Marcos kept her eyes on the screen. He built that thing to survive exactly this. No delicate parts to fry, just simple machinery and manual controls. Inside the rover, Walter continued forward. sweat beading on his forehead as he carefully maneuvered around another obstacle, a massive chunk of what looked like an old satellite dish, its edges sharp enough to tear through most modern hulls. His rover's thick armor plating scraped against a smaller piece of debris, the sound harsh and metallic, but the vehicle held together without so much as a dent penetrating through. He checked the tracking beacon he had been given before launch, following its faint signal toward the crashed smuggler ship. The wreck came into view slowly, half buried beneath layers of twisted metal from an old collision, its hull cracked open in several places. Walter guided his rover carefully alongside it, finding a section of the hull damaged enough to create an opening he could squeeze through. He parked the rover as close as possible, grabbed a small emergency kit, and climbed out through the airlock, stepping carefully onto the wreck's surface. The gravity here was unstable, shifting unpredictably due to the mining accident that had created this debris field decades ago. Walter moved cautiously, using handholds welded onto his suit for exactly this kind of situation, making his way toward the cargo hold where the tracking beacon indicated the Cub was trapped. Inside, the cargo hold was dim, lit only by a few flickering emergency lights. Walter found the containment pod near the back, its systems clearly damaged, warning lights blinking weakly. Through the pod's cracked window, he could see the Cub curled in the corner, its fur matted, its body trembling from fear and cold. It looked nothing like the fierce predator the treaties described. It looked like a frightened animal, alone and hurt, waiting for anyone to help. Walter approached slowly, lowering himself to the pod's level, moving with the same patience he used when handling injured animals back on Earth many years ago. He remembered raising a wounded wolf pup once, back when he was young, learning that fear responded best to calm, quiet presence rather than sudden movements. "Easy now," he murmured softly, his voice low and steady despite the mask muffling his words. "I'm not here to hurt you." The Cub's eyes, wide and golden, locked onto him, its body tensing further at first. But something about Walter's calm demeanor, the steady way he moved, seemed to ease its fear slightly. He worked carefully at the pod's damaged locking mechanism, using simple tools instead of relying on any electronic override that might not function properly in the unstable environment. After several tense minutes, the lock finally gave way and the pod's door slid open. The Cub did not move at first, still frightened, still unsure. Walter simply sat back, giving it space, waiting patiently rather than rushing forward. Slowly, hesitantly, the Cub crept forward, sniffing cautiously at his outstretched hand. Somewhere deep in the wreck, a groaning sound echoed through the metal walls. The debris field was shifting again, gravity pockets moving unpredictably, threatening to crush the already damaged ship further. Walter knew they were running out of time. Gently, carefully, he reached out and lifted the Cub into his arms, feeling its trembling body slowly begin to calm against him. It was time to leave, time to make the dangerous journey back through the debris field, back toward the safety of the station. Walter held the Cub close and began making his way back toward his waiting rover, praying silently that both of them would make it out alive. The wreck groaned again, louder this time, metal bending under pressure somewhere deep within its broken frame. Walter moved as quickly as he safely could, cradling the trembling Cub against his chest while carefully navigating the unstable gravity pockets scattered throughout the ship. Every step required precision, every handhold checked before he trusted his weight to it. One mistake here could mean falling into open space, or worse, being crushed as the wreck continued to collapse under the shifting debris field. He finally reached the airlock and climbed back into his rover, setting the Cub down gently in the small space behind the pilot's seat. It curled up immediately, still frightened, but seeming to sense that this strange, gentle human meant it no harm. Walter wasted no time securing the hatch and starting the engine, the familiar rumble filling the cockpit as he began navigating back through the debris field. The return journey proved far more dangerous than the trip in. The mining accident that had created this graveyard of wreckage decades ago had left behind unpredictable gravity pockets, and they were shifting rapidly now, some pulling debris together violently while others pushed it apart in sudden, unpredictable bursts. Walter gripped the controls tightly, his eyes scanning every direction as pieces of broken satellites and shattered hulls tumbled dangerously close to his rover. Back on the station, tension filled the observation deck as everyone watched the grainy camera feed. Director Marcos stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly together, while Dax and Torin leaned forward, their earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine concern. "The field is becoming more unstable," an officer called out from a nearby console. "Gravity readings are spiking. If he doesn't find a clear path soon, that whole section could collapse." Dax studied the shifting debris on the screen, his sharp eyes catching something the others had missed. "There, look. That gap between the two large wreckage clusters. It is narrow, but it leads directly toward open space." Torin squinted at the screen, doubt still evident in his expression. "That gap is far too tight for any of our ships. Even our smallest scout could not fit through cleanly." "But his could," Dax said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "That thing was built small, compact, without all the extra systems our ships carry. It might actually work." Director Marcos immediately radioed the coordinates to Walter, her voice tense but steady. "Walter, there's a narrow gap forming between two debris clusters, coordinates transmitting now. It's tight, but it might be your best chance to reach open space before the field collapses further." Inside the rover, Walter received the coordinates and adjusted his course immediately, guiding his vehicle toward the narrow opening. The gap looked impossibly tight as he approached, jagged metal edges lining both sides, ready to tear through anything that scraped against them. He took a deep breath, steadying his hands on the controls, and eased the rover forward. The vehicle's sides scraped against the debris on both sides, sparks flying as metal ground against metal. Warning lights flashed across the dashboard, but Walter kept his focus, inching the rover forward through the narrow passage. Behind him, he could hear the cub whimpering softly, clearly frightened by the harsh sounds and violent shaking of the vehicle. "Almost there," Walter muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Just a little further." A massive piece of wreckage suddenly shifted directly ahead, blocking part of the narrow gap. Walter's heart pounded as he quickly adjusted the controls, tilting the rover slightly to squeeze past the new obstacle. The vehicle's armor plating scraped hard against the metal, denting deeply, but holding together despite the impact. This was exactly why he had built it this way, thick and sturdy, able to take damage that would have destroyed any sleeker ship instantly. On the station, everyone watched in tense silence as the rover continued its dangerous path through the narrowing gap. Director Marcos held her breath, watching the readouts closely. "He's almost through, just a little more." With one final push, Walter guided the rover through the last section of the gap, the debris field opening up into clearer space just ahead. He pressed the throttle forward, gaining speed as the wreckage behind him began to shift violently, the entire section collapsing inward moments after he cleared it, as if the field itself had been waiting to close the moment he escaped. A cheer erupted across the observation deck as the rover became visible on the main screen, moving steadily away from the collapsing debris field toward the safety of the station. Director Marcos allowed herself a small, relieved smile, while Dax and Torin exchanged a look of genuine astonishment. Inside the rover, Walter finally allowed himself to relax slightly, his hands still trembling faintly from the tension of the journey. He glanced behind him, finding the cub had crept closer during the chaos, now pressed gently against the back of his seat, no longer trembling with fear, but instead watching him with something that looked almost like trust. "We made it," Walter said softly, offering the cub a tired but genuine smile. "Just a little further now and you'll be safe." The rover continued steadily toward the station, its battered frame carrying both an old mechanic and a young predator safely home, proving once again that sometimes the simplest, sturdiest things carry the most important journeys. The landing bay doors opened with a hiss of pressurized air as Walter's rover rolled slowly inside, its battered frame scratched and dented from the journey through the debris field. A crowd had gathered, station workers, traders, and medical teams all waiting anxiously to see the outcome of the rescue. As the rover came to a stop, cheers erupted through the bay, loud and genuine, echoing off the metal walls. Walter climbed out first, his legs slightly unsteady from the tension of the journey, but his expression calm as always. He turned back and gently lifted the cub from behind his seat, carrying it carefully in his arms as medical teams rushed forward with a specialized containment unit designed for its species. The cub, exhausted but alive, allowed itself to be transferred, though it kept its golden eyes fixed on Walter until the very last moment, as if reluctant to leave the strange, gentle human who had rescued it. Director Marcos approached quickly, relief evident on her face as she watched the medical teams begin their examination. "Its vitals are stabilizing," one of the medics called out. "Given a little time and proper care, it should make a full recovery." A wave of relief swept through the crowd, and Director Marcos turned to Walter, extending her hand. "You did it. I honestly did not think it was possible, but you did it." Walter accepted the handshake with a tired smile, wiping a bit of grease and dust off his forehead with his other hand. "Just needed something that wouldn't quit halfway through," he said simply, his eyes drifting toward the battered rover still parked nearby, steam rising faintly from its overworked engine. Nearby, Dax and Torrin stood watching the scene, their earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced now by something closer to quiet respect. They exchanged a glance before approaching Walter together, both looking slightly uncertain about what to say. Torrin spoke first, his voice more subdued than before. "We laughed at your vehicle. We called it primitive, useless. We were wrong." Dax nodded in agreement. "Our ships, for all their speed and technology, could not have done what yours did today. We underestimated you, and we underestimated what real engineering means." Walter studied them for a moment, then offered a small, understanding nod. He was not the type to hold grudges or demand apologies, but he appreciated their honesty nonetheless. "Speed and shine have their place," he said. "But when things get tough, when it really matters, you need something that just keeps going, no matter what gets thrown at it. That's all I ever wanted to build." The two aliens seemed to consider his words carefully, glancing toward the rover with newfound respect. "Perhaps," Dax said slowly, "there is more to learn from simple, sturdy design than we realized." As the days passed following the rescue, news of the event spread quickly across neighboring star systems. The story of the old human mechanic who had risked his life to save the galaxy's most precious predator, using nothing more than a homemade rover built from scrap and stubborn determination, became something of a legend among traders and travelers passing through the station. The cub, meanwhile, continued to recover under careful medical supervision, growing stronger each day. Word came eventually that its recovery was going smoothly, and plans were made to eventually return it to the Kesh Reserve, back among its own kind, where it would grow to become another symbol of the fragile peace between the galaxy's star nations. Walter, true to his nature, returned to his quiet life in the garage, fixing old parts and helping travelers with their broken-down ships, seemingly unaffected by the sudden fame that had found him. He rarely spoke about the rescue unless someone specifically asked, and even then, he kept his answers simple and modest, always deflecting credit toward the rover itself rather than himself. Months later, a small package arrived at his garage, delivered by a station courier. Inside was a photograph, sent by the reserve caretakers, showing the cub, now larger and stronger, standing proudly among the tall grass of its homeworld, its golden eyes as sharp and alert as the day Walter had first found it trembling in that damaged pod. A short note accompanied the photograph, simply thanking him for giving it a second chance at life. Walter pinned the photograph to the wall of his garage, right beside a small model of his old rover that a grateful station worker had built for him as a gift. He glanced at it often while working, a quiet reminder of just how much a simple, sturdy thing could accomplish when it truly mattered. Years later, long after Walter had grown even older, stories still circulated among station workers and traders about the old mechanic and his battered rover, the ones who once again proved that appearances meant little compared to true reliability and heart. Somewhere in a museum on a nearby trade hub, the actual rover itself sat proudly displayed, a symbol of resilience over vanity, though Walter himself remained mostly unaware of its growing fame, content simply to keep fixing what others called junk, turning it into something useful once again.